So welcome everyone to another monthly AI in construction webinar. I try as often as we can to try to anchor AI in the discussion in actual work that's being done. And we've talked to a bunch of folks from the field. We've talked to, Cumulus that makes standard operating procedures. And we've actually talked to two companies that look at contracts. In both cases, they were more about the risks and how to navigate the overall contract. What we're going to talk about today is, for those of you who know me, I've got a little bit of a background in specifications and in more than one way. So we're going to talk about that. There's a couple of things that I want to do here. One of them is we will talk about a specific product, and it's ours. But the bigger point is, how are we able to use AI as it stands today to look at really big documents or really big amounts of information? So there's more going on here than just talking about a product. There's some really interesting, I think, perspectives that I've come across on how to think about the use of AI and how we're using it to navigate really big, content blocks, whether in this case, it's a big document or set of documents, but it'll be true for other things as well. For those of you who are interested in specifics about contracts like AIA 201 and 101 and so on, check out the October and January webinars. So in this case, again, we're going to be looking at specs in the context of a more general point about how to look at big documents. So just as a quick refresher, specs are the what and how to build part of a project manual. They're paired with drawings. Depending on the contract, they are the hierarchically superior. If there's in other words, if there's a conflict, it's the specs. It's not always true, but it often is. And they sit under, usually as an appendage of the larger construction contract. These things are huge. I say this with love, but they can be a pain. They're not the only reason for rework, but they are a contributor. And in fact, some of the data here, implies that of the documents, a lot of issues come from contract documents, and specs are where the details are that you're most likely to get wrong that would cause rework. I don't know that payment or other things that might be in general conditions are necessarily going to be a cause for rework. So the whole point of all of this is specs are worth paying attention to. They're worth being able to look at as quickly and easily as possible. And AI, this is one of those moments where AI presents a really great opportunity to get things easier, faster, more efficiently than was true before. Now, the reality of what I just said, and again, I'm a little biased here because we spent time trying to solve this problem, is specs get ignored a lot. I mean, obviously in the beginning of a project, they don't, but once you're 6 months in and things are busy, yes, you'll send someone to go look for the specs, but we all know that doesn't always happen. So a lot of what we're asking is, great, can AI help with that? On the right-hand side of this, these are actual settlements from a lawyer that I know. So, this really can, and each one of them was caused by someone ignoring the spec. So it really can be a big deal. So how do we figure out how to get around this issue of specs are the contractual document? They're the thing to which you are held, but they're often a pain to work with, especially again, when there's 1,000 things going on and you're 6 months into the project and you're short of labor like everyone is. So the first thing you think about is, all right, how do you use AI to make specs consumable so you can find things quickly? Makes a ton of sense. Easy to say, I can tell you with personal experience, not as easy to do in a reliable, kind of enterprise ready way. Like just plugging in ChatGPT is going to get you some things. It's often seductively good until you actually want to rely on it. So this is a good opportunity to talk about what happens when AI is pointed, and I specifically mean this sort of chatbot, large language model technology that we're hearing so much about. What happens when you point that at a big document? Some of you may have heard from earlier presentations, I talked about retrieval augmented generation. This is one of those moments. So actually, this is a little bit of a backgrounder on how RAG works, but also what some of its limits are and some of its capabilities. So, I joke here, all right, great, so you got a chatbot, what do you do to make it work? How do you make this thing perform? And what we're going to talk about now is a little bit of what goes into that and why you should trust that a product will do its job, or at least you'll know that you'll have good questions to ask. So let's start with what even happens when this goes on. So you popped in a massive document. Some of these things are, excuse me, 3,000-4,000 pages long. What happens? Does it just go into some, bucket somewhere and it can just read it? And the answer is obviously no. Well, I don't know if it's obvious, but the answer is no. So let's say you got 2,500 pages, just a healthy spec book. The first thing that's going to happen is it doesn't just go and sit somewhere. It actually gets chopped up into chunks. And this is actually a key part of the AI workflow, something that we spend a lot of time on, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit more in just a minute. So the first thing that happens is that massive document gets chopped up into chunks, and it gets chopped up into a lot of them. These are often something like 1,000 and maybe less tokens, which could mean, 4 or 5, well, actually less than that, actually. So maybe a paragraph is not a bad way to start. That's actually tunable, how big the chunks are. But the point is, it gets processed in a way that makes it useful for an LLM. Now, this is super nerdy, but what happens then is it gets embedded. The reason that matters is these two things, how you chunk and how you embed, are actually key variables and key things that can get tuned to make the chatbot work better. Give you an example of that. Almost every time OpenAI releases a new model, what GPT-4 Turbo, I think, is the most recent, they'll often release an embedding model also. So how you take these chunks and put them into a network so they have meaning isn't a binary thing. It isn't you do it or you don't. There's better and worse ways of doing it. Sometimes the ways that are good for a really general purpose solution, for example, might be not as good as a specific solution. So it's a lot of work that gets done into figuring out how to embed and how to embed it as efficiently and correctly as you can. The next thing that happens, so all that happened behind the scenes. The user then enters a prompt. So how many inspections are needed for concrete? I kind of made that one up. What's interesting here is what you don't see is there's behind the scenes inside of the system a system prompt. If any of you have used ChatGPT Plus, you may have seen the customization field. You can go into your profile and go to the customization screen. That's the equivalent of a system prompt. So this can do things like, when responding, use bullets for lists, or keep language crisp and clear. I have an MBA, so I couldn't help but make fun of this, because we'll do things like put a word in there and say, when you see words like this, it's often going to mean we can't answer that, or here's how we're going to answer it, or ask for clarification. So you can include things like keywords to tune the system to behave better. Because what happens with, and we'll learn more about that in a second, what happens with chatbots is people start thinking they're talking to people and ask questions that actually a junior person wouldn't be able to answer, much less AI. Something, again, we'll get into in just a sec. What's important now is all that comes combined, and it goes and looks for the highest probability matches among the chunks that were embedded before. So that's a lot of things all at once. Basically, what we're saying is we're taking your content, we're chunking it up so that it's as small and useful as possible. We're then giving those chunks meaning versus each other. Then we're going to go and take the input from the user. So that's one half, and then the embedding is the other, and we find the match, which gives you your answer. So I go through this for a couple of reasons. One is it's really not that complicated, and it helps you to understand some of what's going on under the hood, so that when you're using anything from SpecGPT, our product, to ChatGPT and the dozens of copilots out there, you have a sense of what you're working with. Now, there's a lot of things that can get tuned to make the system work better for what you're using it for. And the reason I went through that is to say, how do we do better than just raw ChatGPT? How do you get better answers, crisper responses, avoid hallucinations? So we've talked about that before. That's when it makes up an answer. But also complete coverage of a whole document. 2,500 pages, even for AI, is not that easy to completely process and cover. So often it's good to make the problem smaller and point it at things. But also, what really interesting emerging capability is you're not just looking at the core document, you can upload other things that enhance the answers and give it better answers. And I'll show you what I mean about that in a second. So the point is, okay, ChatGPT can do some stuff, but A, we don't know where the data is going. We kind of do, but there's still a concern about that. B, it's not really optimized for this. So it'll work sometimes, but maybe I want something that's going to be better, faster, and give me enhanced answers. So the reason I went through the steps before is it tells you you've got 3 levers that you can work with on the product side. One is, how are you splitting the document into chunks? Are you just kind of chopping it wherever you feel like it, or are you doing something a little more intelligent? What about the system prompt? Are you working to make sure that that is really optimizing the answer and giving people the best experience they can? The final one wasn't in there before, and that's called fine-tuning, which you've heard me talk about before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. So I'm going to go quickly through each of these to give you an idea of how that becomes real. Like, what would splitting the document even mean? So chunking is, again, how are you splitting it? There's a few ways this gets done. There's more than just this, but here are three nice ones. One of them is just text length. So text length. So for example, every 1,000 characters, it's a pretty big chunk, but you get my point. Or styling. How about the beginning of paragraphs? What if you got a really long paragraph or a short paragraph? But that might make sense depending, again, on what you're trying to get done. For B2B applications like construction, you're often going to find that a proprietary method makes better sense, certainly to get the most out of what you're doing. An example of that is what we built at the link, where we put, first of all, we start with a pretty good knowledge of specs and how they're built and so on, but also we put thousands of specs through an analysis engine and created a proprietary map of specifications. So it's not just where things start and stop, but what ideas are in what order and what content should be where and so on, so that your chunks on their own have some meaning as opposed to just being arbitrary chunks. So that's one of the ways that you're going to find people get better answers from LLMs, is by putting some intelligence into some of the pre-processing. Now, once I use that word pre-processing, those of you who've dealt with software and data before have heard that 100 times. And that really is what chunking is. It's pre-processing. So one of the ways to do that is by a proprietary map or ontology, which is what we've done. The second one is the system prompt, and this is actually of everything you can do, this is the most flexible, because you can edit. It's just text. You can edit it pretty quickly and add things and subtract things. We've got dozens of these that we've tested, so it allows for really flexible tuning of LLM responses, and it doesn't even require a developer to do. So the customer success team, or you name it, can go in there and look at this. Certainly on the testing side. What's cool about this is it gives it extra direction, so it can help to disambiguate if you've got extra knowledge-based resource, like you've uploaded your lessons learned or whatever it might be. But also, again, if there are questions people keep asking that no spec can answer, there's just stuff we hear. You'll see more about that in a sec. It's a good way of handling things so people get the best experience that they can. So, and I mentioned optimizing because this is one of those moments, a little bit like email or other things in marketing, where you will optimize by trying a lot of things. So this allows you to do that, which is really cool. There's actually tooling and software out there that can help you do this at some scale. So you're trying different system prompt plus common prompt combinations. Is it giving us what we want? Responding to user requests, make the system answer more appropriately for the use case. I kind of mentioned that before. We're doing this all the time. Again, it's just one of those things where you're never going to get it perfect, but you can continue to try to get it better and better. The final way in this kind of three-part that I mentioned is fine-tuning is a really interesting thing, and OpenAI has just made that easier. Like, I want to say 2-3 weeks ago, they released a fine-tuning kind of tooling that allows you to retrain a model to respond the way you want. Now, it's important to note here, the underlying models are big beyond your ability to understand. 1 trillion parameters, we don't even know what that, I mean, literally, that's just a word to me. So you're not changing that. What you're doing is changing how it responds. And what that means is, and I'm going to get a little nerdy here, but an LLM actually produces a bunch of responses. What you do is tune it to come up with the one that is the most appropriate. A lot of the lower probability responses are hidden from you because it has a filter. So what you're doing is, this is actually what made ChatGPT useful, by the way. Why before ChatGPT, all the big LLMs weren't really that useful for most people. By fine-tuning it with something called reinforcement learning with human feedback, they were able to fine-tune it so it gave better answers. Well, you can take that even further and say, great, I care about, I don't know, civil construction. So I'm going to tune it to answer and look for things that are relevant to that, but also look in its own memory for things that are relevant to that. Most of the model, as I mentioned, stays the same. It's interesting that it can make certain memories of the LLM more salient by tuning towards them. It can add this interpretation layer to guide behavior. But also what's interesting is it can encourage selective forgetting of information that you don't need. This is an important one because what people that do fine-tuning sometimes find is that the LLM lost the ability to understand or do things that you maybe still want it to do, which is one of the reasons why you don't just do it and then walk away. You still want to test your way into that as well. The issue with fine-tuning is it's a bigger lift than the other two things we talked about. And you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding and you test your way into really getting what you want. And frankly, you can often get great behavior without needing to fine tune. So it's a balance. All of this is a balance between what's easy and fast and what is really powerful but more permanent. What's cool about this is it's rare that software has the ability to include people that are directly talking to customers that often. And in the case of certainly the system prompt, you're able to get people who are talking to customers very, all the time to actually test and try things out. So you're broadening the ability to have input to the product without endangering its stability or having people like me write code, which is a bad plan. So what's all that do? In an earlier session, I talked about AI is at its best when you make the problem as small as you can. Just like a human, by the way. We always joke with people, don't try to boil the ocean. Well, that idea is just as true for AI as it is for a human. Anything you can do to make the problem more focused, more smaller, is going to make it more efficient. So chunking means the LLM search is more efficient because it's not just trying to match a random bunch of letters, but it actually, it already has some semantic meaning, the chunk does. Better system prompt means the LLM matching is more efficient because you're pointing it at things. So in the case of chunking, the thing to be matched is better. The system prompt is the way it gets matched is better. And fine tuning means the other end of the match, which is the LLM itself, is more efficient. So overall, as I say, you're asking less of the model because you're giving it a better brief. You're giving it a better answer. You're making the problem smaller. You're going to hear that. I almost have a bumper sticker for make the problem smaller. It's just such a common way of making AI perform better. So we've talked now about how to make the product perform better, but ultimately the user prompts are also part of how this does or doesn't work. Now it's important to know that at this stage, we expect everybody to treat our product and really any LLM as if it were Google. So you're still getting one-shot questions. What I hope you're going to walk away from this session with an understanding that that's leaving money on the table. There's a lot of value in sequential questions, asking again and again, and I'll get into what we mean by that. So we've talked about what a prompt is. It's a question or an instruction to generative AI to produce something. You're supplying the context that a human would. You usually want to put more in your prompt than you might with someone you already know. Because in the case of Google, in the case of Facebook, they're often providing a lot of context that the LLM doesn't have right now. So to put that in even more context, generative AI is not just software. It's not just another Excel that does cool stuff. It's different from other software, even Google searches, which are just a souped up version of classic. I mean, there's a lot of AI under the hood, but the thing that you're interacting with behaves like software. The quality of the response can really be improved by asking better questions. And frankly, Google's kind of on the edge there. A better search query is going to give you a better answer also. The delta is just a lot higher, I think, with generative AI. You can do things from it that aren't just giving you the answer, they're giving you the solution. So maybe it's a list, not just one answer. And it's not a list that it went and found that was already there. It'll create a list for you, which is great. It'll get you a summary. It'll get a combination of documents. So you can, contrast one document versus another, which is really exciting. And it's reasonable to assume that you'll be able to actually upload videos and have that do the same thing, that videos will be treated the same way a document does. It's not quite there yet, but it's coming pretty soon, we think. So this is really exciting. The fact that the whole point of using a SpecGPT or similar is that you're not just getting search. It's not just Control F. It's not just finding an instance of something. It's answering a question. It's solving a problem for you. And that's an important point, this idea of solving a problem, because that's the path that we're on, is the complexity of problems that it can solve will continue to get more and more sophisticated over time, which is super exciting. So an example of that, right? So what are all the inspections needed for concrete? Well, it lists this out. In fact, you can't see that it's an even bigger list. There's just only so much I wanted to show. And I purposely took a screenshot here of the fact that the sources are available as well. I'll get into that in a little bit, but it's important to note that there's still a concern that did it get everything I need it to? And in this case, it'll go and show you where it got it so you can double check if you want. Similarly, summarizing. So at what temperature can I pour concrete? So we asked that question and you get actually a pretty detailed set of answers that help a lot. So it's summarizing what was in more than one place, which is great. Also, this is a fun one. I created a document that lists videos of how to do an inspection based on ASTM numbers. So those of you who are familiar with this sort of thing, very often the inspection that is supposed to be done for something is defined by an ASTM number. So I went and looked and found some videos. And the cool thing is it'll find the video for you. So it goes through the spec, and if it finds the ASTM number, it returns the standard way of inspecting it. So you can imagine how it wouldn't be so hard to provide, PEs or the QA team or whoever it is that needs to know extra things about how to do their job, that you upload a document that says, here are the things that we want you to remember, whether it's safety, whether it's QA, whether it's, scope gaps, because often specs don't go all the way and we want to add it. You're able to say, find what was in the spec and then relate it to this, and then return it when someone asks for it. Hold on a sec. So the answer is, yeah, right now we didn't have the URLs turned on, but we're fixing that. So for this demo, I didn't have that turned on. The spec number, yes. So I didn't capture it here. If you were to scroll down, which of course, this is the problem with doing things like this. Hang on a minute, let me get back to where I want to be. There we go. If you scroll down, you'd be able to source the actual documents it compared to. And was there another question now? Okay. So those are some really interesting kind of ideas that are I want to say obvious, but they're expanded ways that SpecGPT and other let's just say SpecGPT can answer questions. But the next thing I want you to think about, and this is a big takeaway hopefully from today, is the reason they call it a chatbot versus another search engine other than the branding is you can do more than one question. So the system, and the interesting thing, and I implied this before, when you're doing a series and you don't like refresh it and say new chat, it actually takes the old question and answer and includes it with your new question and gives you a response that considers what you'd been asking before. Now, look, it can run out of gas if you do this 15 times in a row, but often the second or third answer, depending on what you're asking, can become really, really interesting and really high quality. So I'd encourage you to try a series of prompts when you're playing around or when you're actually using products like ours to see if it's able to get you answers. Even if the first time it wasn't able to get you quite what you want, you ask it again and it's using the last thing you asked also as context. And we find that again, you get some really high quality answers that are beyond what you normally expect to get from something like a chatbot. So I think it's important that folks get into the habit of being able to get in the habit rather of asking sequences of questions and treating this as if you were talking to a robot instead of asking a Google question. So Anthony, the question legally is if it gives the wrong response and causes a problem, who's at risk? That's a contractual issue I'm happy to talk offline about. The reason why the underlying document is there is so that you can check and make sure that it isn't the wrong response. So every answer certainly that we're giving is anchored in the document, and you can find it in the document as opposed to, trust us. So thinking about prompting, imagine you've got an intern, and I kind of implied this before, smart, but no experience. To get them to do something, you're going to have to give them context, steps, and often an example where possible. So as I've heard me say before, AI is not magic. It needs at least as much as an intern in terms of context and background. So when you're thinking about how to write a prompt, all of what I just said before, think about it through that lens, that you're not clicking on Google. What you're doing is talking to a cognitive machine, which is really a different paradigm. One of the things that you've heard people talk about, and I think we're all going to develop this skill, is complicated prompting. So if you want something that's a little bit more complex, are there any risks associated with masonry on this project? So now you're looking to break down the problem into steps, and you would tell it to do this. The prompt would say, review the items in the masonry section, list everything that involves like other material. Let's just assume that that's what your risks were. Compare those with the materials that list in the masonry risks document. Provide a summary of that comparison. So you need to give it a little bit of instruction as if, again, you were talking to an intern so that they know how to execute. They'll go do it for you, especially the kind of legwork, but ultimately you need to tell it how to get that done. what we're finding is you get a lot more out of chatbots and SpecGPTs if you're thinking like this, as opposed to just one-off questions. Then there are the impossible questions. And I say this as like tongue in cheek, but just like an intern, if you asked it to answer really high level questions that only someone pretty senior could answer, it's not going to be able to give you a good answer. It's just, you couldn't ask an intern, you couldn't ask AI. Is this spec complete? Like the problem with that is, what against what? Are there any risks in this spec? Is there anything missing from this spec? All of those are kind of tough because it implies a knowledge that the AI wouldn't necessarily have, both of what would be a complete project, but also what this type of project might need. So this is where knowledge management can come in, though. So if you're asking the raw AI, it's probably not going to give you a good answer. What you can do, though, is for higher level questions like this, give it something to relate to. So you can create your own knowledge base to enhance the analysis. An example, sorry, this is a bit of an eye chart. I wanted to cover a few things, but those questions, anything missing, anything, is it complete? A way to do that would be a spec section list from similar projects to compare it to, list of critical elements for similar projects. So you'd need to provide it with something that it could do the comparison, but it's still going to be able to compare an awful lot of things. The list of common missing items for similar projects. So again, this is knowledge that a lot of PMs and senior folks are able to produce relatively easily in a pretty short interview, and I'll get into that in a sec. That allows you to ask questions that are like, how do we take the knowledge from a senior person and automate it for the low level stuff like this? There's no automating intuition, experience, and judgment. However, pulling a list like this and say, hey, here's a starting point anyway, is one of the ways you're going to find AI increasingly used. It's worth noting in all of this, I've talked before about human in the loop and the difference between a first draft versus a completed, no one ever needs to look at it. All AI right now, no matter what it is, needs a human in the loop. It's giving you information, it's giving you input. Ultimately, your judgment is going to be, okay, that sounds right, or that's a start, and I'm going to go look myself and see if there's anything else. So often you're automating 80% of the job, which is kind of how you think about this. Sometimes 100%, but it's important to keep in mind that where the state of any software is it's an input to human decision making. It isn't a replacement for it. So I'm going to go on to a pretty new, not idea, but something I don't hear enough, and that is, how do you generate the knowledge? Now, the knowledge is already there, but how do you generate knowledge bases? This is easier than it sounds. It turns out I've spent earlier part of my year, I did a lot of market research, and I can tell you that pulling really useful information from people is easier than it sounds. I think the first thing you want to do is figure out what you would want. So again, I mentioned before masonry risks, just to take an example. Grab a project manual. And again, I'm a little biased towards that as your index, but it's an easy thing to do. Grab a project manual and go through the spec sections and ask a structured list of questions. So now you're not asking somebody to scratch their chin and tell you all the things that could go wrong. You're grounding it in real projects, and that tends to be a way better way to get a volume of information from someone as opposed to a couple of top of mind ideas. So asking what's gone wrong here, what are risks here? Are there any examples you have? And just record this. You don't have to type it, you don't have to write it, you can transcribe it. What is usually missing? And again, you can expand this list as you see fit, but these are some easy questions, and you just roll through this section by section until someone tells you I got to go to lunch. You can record the answers, transcribe them, and here's the fun part. Ask ChatGPT to summarize and create a well-indexed document for you. So you can automate a lot of this. So really it winds up being a recorded, guided conversation over lunch, or take an hour and do this. We've got examples I'm happy to share with folks or walk you through this in a little bit more detail. But the point is, and I think for this industry, this is a really important idea and important practice that I hope we begin to do more of, where we're allowing people to share their knowledge. And again, this is pretty low level stuff. This isn't really like senior level judgment. This is more like, hey, here's some things you might look out for. The kind of lessons learned, but here you're indexing it against, in this case, I would suggest indexing it against master format, because then you can find other places where it'll be applicable. One of the problems with knowledge management always is, how do you make it useful at the time of use? And indexing it against what project manuals are organized by just seems like an obvious way to do it. You don't have to do it that way, but that's just an easy one for me. So I encourage folks to think about this and think about what are some quality related issues, some safety related issues, some product, whatever it might be, where you might sit there and just do it yourself if you want, and literally record yourself going through it. Because once you've done that, you have the ability to upload it and apply it, or give it to other people to apply. Kind of getting you to this idea of a knowledge co-pilot. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of how this can be used for real work. Now, in some cases, this isn't stuff, most cases, this isn't stuff I've done. So bear with me with some of the examples. But for architects and engineers, right, you have it right there with you. Was a draft spec. So the other thing is, I implied that we're talking about mature specs. There's no reason the draft spec can't get uploaded. None at all. So when you're in the middle of looking for a product or looking for doing some of your research, the ability to quickly find some things or cross-reference some things, it's just it saves a ton of time. You think about the job of a spec writer for sure. A lot of that is research and cross-referencing this and cross-referencing that. So having this as the ability to navigate documents is a big deal. Again, the 1,000 other details as you're writing specs. Now, for estimators, you can imagine fast checks for unexpected cross drivers. Here's an example where a knowledge base might make sense. We've done some work with gotchas that can be found in Division 1, for example. It's not a complete list because there's no such thing. What it does, though, is get you started and give you things to think about. List of items, so on. So just a quick research. I want to navigate the spec real quick as I'm going through, and I forgot about that, and I forgot about this. So that's another way that you can see this being super useful. Now, project engineers, half the job, or at least a meaningful part of the job, is to go find answers, make sure of things. What you see on the right is actually the mobile view. What's the slump test again? So I look for that one. But fast answers for all the large and small questions that come up, and you can do it on mobile. For the trades, same things that you would do from before, but in this case, maybe even more detail. So exact details from the spec as they're being executed. So rather than going just on muscle memory, hey, let's just make sure I understand. I use HVAC requirements here, but it's really anything. I want to make sure that we're answering exactly to the specs so we don't get in trouble later. And closeout, right? Closeout is everyone's favorite part of a job. I just grabbed the same thing for HVAC. Again, look at a list of closeout requirements, double check while you're executing so you don't get caught later. So a lot of this is this fundamental shift from where finding information was a pain in the neck to now it should be as fast as you can type, or in some cases as fast as you can talk, to just get what you want. We like to make the analogy that you probably heard me say. It's kind of like where maps used to be, printed and a pain in the neck to use. You only really used them when it was a disaster or the beginning of the trip, maybe. Specs are kind of like that. Well, Google Maps has made it so that if you're even a little unsure, it's so painless to check that, I used it to go down the road. Not too far down the road, because it's so easy. So the idea being is throughout the execution of a project, make it so that people can, if there's even a question, just double check. And you've got it right there. And again, if there's any question about whether that's right, wrong, or complete, at the bottom of every one of these answers, again, these answers are typically a little longer than I wanted to cut and paste here. You have the source document, so you can click in and double check and make sure. This is, I guess what I was saying, for peace of mind. So you can check the underlying docs at any time. So you can click and see what the actual text was, but under that, you can click the underlying document itself. So the point being is, yeah, you get answers fast, but you also have the ability to cover risk and say, let's just make sure that this is what was in there. And, grab the content if you want to, as a note if necessary. So I'm going to pause for a sec before I go into the final point and say that, what we've gone through now is some of the ways that, when we use the word co-pilot, it isn't really co-pilot in that it's not doing things yet. And I say that advisedly because that's the next step, is getting to agents. And trust me, you'll hear about that in a couple of months. Right now, it's more like you've got a research assistant. You've got something that's right there that can answer questions for you and go search things and summarize and so on and so forth. It really is, though, a new paradigm, and I want to underscore this. So I'll go through a little bit here. So some of you may remember that before 1993, finding information was difficult, slow, and expensive. I did not go to that library. This is actually ChatGPT, but you get the point. You had to go look at actual documents or a microfiche, which, trust me, wasn't better. 94, everything changed. The World Wide Web opened access to everybody. So just that was a new paradigm. Suddenly it wasn't paper, it was web pages, it was documents online. However, it became a pain in the neck really quickly. An uncharted forest is sort of how I said it. Again, thank you, ChatGPT, for some pretty good visuals here. So there started to be, it stalled growth. There was so many websites. If you didn't know where to go, it was hard to find things. Then Google came out. They actually came out in 98, but they really became popular in 2000. It looked like that back then. They got a little smarter. That changed things completely because suddenly, no matter how big the web got, no matter how many examples of a thing there are, you could find what you're looking for, or at least get there. So super exciting. The difference between 93 and 2000, we massive leap in ability to find what you're looking for out in the world. Right now, up and until 2021, finding information was really one-way search. So as good as all that was, the best you could do was get a bad result and answer, get a bad result. You really didn't have two-way communication. So as of November 22nd, we're in a new era. And I really want to talk about the difference for a minute. You had documents to web pages to search, but it's still just software. It didn't add any value to the content. It just showed it to you. Cognitive systems, it's a word that if you haven't heard it before, you're going to hear it more. It is a way of thinking about what LLMs and all of that are, is that they're doing something meaningfully different. And we like to call it cognitive without calling it thinking because it's not quite the same. But what it will do is add intelligence to content. And that paradigm shift is going to take a while for us all to figure out. It's going to take a while to really onboard the fact that it can do things for you. You want to double check it and know that it's going to fail in weird ways. But nevertheless, it can automate and or augment a lot of what you're doing. So when you think about products like ours, or you think about ChatGPT or the dozens of copilots out there, keep in mind that you're not just talking about a super duper search engine. You're talking about a cognitive system that can add intelligence and do more than you might think to ask. This is one of the reasons I tell everybody to get a GPT Plus, subscription, because you want to be able to play with this and get comfortable with it. So some key takeaways here, working with cognitive systems like SpecGPT, think of them as interns, limited interns, and hopefully over time, they're going to get smarter and smarter. But nevertheless, these are able to do things. They bring intelligence. They don't bring experience, intuition, or judgment, my favorite three words. What they do is, as I say, they're just like an intern, a smart intern who can go research things and maybe do some summaries. You're going to need to add your own intelligence and experience. But the point is you're asking for more than just search. Ask as if you're explaining. So the prompting is really important, not just popping in keywords, and you'll get better things. The other thing, though, is to test limits. So you ask for too much and it won't be able to handle it. There are limits to everything right now. A lot of this is way past what a human limit would be, but nevertheless, it's not unlimited in its ability. The underlying cognitive architecture, so that the LLMs themselves, I'll tell you, in 30 years of working with technology one way or the other, nothing has ever moved even close to this fast. It's amazing. In fact, just I think today or yesterday, OpenAI released another upgrade of GPT-4, which is just going to be smarter and less likely to give you bad answers and just give you smarter, crisper responses. So they're just continuing to do their own version of fine tuning, although it's obviously at a much bigger scale than what we might do. So that is my kind of presentation for today. To learn more, feel free to hop in and go to the link. You can obviously call me anytime. I'll wide open to questions. This one's a little bit shorter because I wanted to dive into a pretty narrow point. So I will answer. Can it list out all the submittals required and be used to keep track of status? This is from Anthony. So that's a great question, Anthony. So the short answer is no, and I say that advisedly. We actually use a different technology to get the submittals. If you want to ask for submittals of a spec section, you're going to get a good answer. If you want it of the whole project, that's a list that's too long for most of them to handle in memory right now. There are better software methods to do that. What's cool, though, is the output of a submittal log can wind up being an input into SpecGPT and other things. So you can actually navigate it quickly, summarize things, and so on. But right now, and it's interesting, the second half of Anthony's question is keep track of the status. It's really actually at a deep point in there. And that is, right now, the way we're using LLMs is as an assistant, but not really as workflow software. At the link, what we do, we actually have a separate thing called tables that is for workflow software, because it's a little bit different. To make it persistent so that you can keep track of things and enter things and so on, there's a lot of little workflow points in there that AI is just, it's not great at it, but more to the point, it's overkill. If you're just testing or not testing, you're just adding, we did this today, we did that today. Having AI in the middle of that is just not helpful. So what you're going to see is more increasing interaction between workflow software like a submittal log or a QA log and so on and so forth, and AI's ability to check it or summarize it or so on. But also the final point, Anthony, I'm sorry to totally beat this question to death. Specs are often a mess. So some of the traditional ways will get you 80% of the way there. And we're finding AI can sometimes find and or weed out things that are under the submittal section that are not submittals, and submittals that maybe are hidden somewhere else. Because again, I've seen, as you can imagine, I've seen specs that are the gamut from, pretty sloppy to incredibly well done. And sometimes just being able to get that extra bit of quality, AI can help with. But the final point is really long lists of things. Often there's better ways to do it with traditional software. Yuji asked a question about drawings. We don't currently handle drawings right now. And frankly, there are companies doing takeoff. The ones that I know that are handling drawings right now are doing takeoff. And all of them have limits to how good they are. Toggle is an example, and they're really good. But just like specs, drawings are all over the map. And people sometimes find that the best AI sometimes struggles to get 100%. So drawings are on our roadmap. But for the moment, there's a lot to be done on the text side. Oh, Dallas just asked the question I was getting at. So Toggle's one of them. There's 2 or 3 others that are out there. It's the answer to your question, Dallas, about how accurate can the cost model be is unfortunately a variable depending on how good or bad the drawings are. I think they get really good. Then you wind up with something that's sloppy or that's got some inconsistency or some difficulty. But I will tell you, it's getting better really, really fast. So definitely check out our friends at Toggle. There's a couple of others out there that are pretty good as well. Work order AI I just had on the podcast. So there's some good options. It isn't something we're specialized in just yet. We typically partner with folks like that. So Dallas's question, yeah, I mentioned this before. So guys, I did record this. I will upload it to YouTube. If you want to find it, just go to YouTube and search for my name. I've got a bunch of them. This will be number 9, I think. So just look for the one from April 11th, and you can get it. So everybody have a look at Pete's comment. A lot of emerging tools in this space. By the way, if any of you know any of these tools and they want to be on a podcast, send them my way. I love to talk to folks that are doing stuff like this. So that's great. Awesome. Well, folks, thank you for joining us. I'm going to give you 15 minutes back. If any of you have any questions, interest in this, want to kick the tires with SpecGPT, let me know. I'm more than happy to give you a trial. Thanks for your time.